Hello RGL2100 students. This week we deal with lesson 2 in our course on regulation theory, and the topic of this week is why and what do we regulate. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that now, and then we'll just carry on with our Zoom call also this week, okay? So let's get started. All right, there's 3 major topics that we're going to cover: public expectations to be protected from harms, different categories of harm, and hazard versus risk in regulation of chemicals. And remember, we in this program deal with the 3 classes of chemicals: pharmaceuticals, agrochemicals, and industrial chemicals. So we have to always keep that diversity in mind when we're talking about these issues. We shouldn't go into these discussions with just thinking purely from a pharmaceutical perspective or purely from an environmental regulatory perspective, but rather we need to grasp the way that our concepts that we introduce to you would apply to various scenarios in all 3 classes of chemicals. So always keep that in mind when I'm talking to you about these lessons, okay? And that will become more obvious as we go through the program, obviously, okay? So let's look at this. Public expectation for protection from harms. So in the eyes of the government, the media, and the public, protecting citizens from harm is a very important expectation. This expectation reveals itself at the level of the individual, the family, social groups, professional groups, non-government organizations, the media, the courts, and in electoral politics are all pressuring the system constantly through various avenues and venues to protect citizenry from harms, right? And so that's a very strong motivator for a democratic country, okay? They take very seriously the mandates to control harm because obviously this is a liberal democratic country, and politicians can be withdrawn through the electoral process, right? And we do have a free media. We do have a free academic community. So there are lots of avenues, diffuse power in society that can critique the government for not protecting citizenry from harm. So harm mitigation or harm reduction becomes a very strong motivator for liberal democratic governments, right? So what are harms? I mean, regulations are primarily designed to address harms or to reduce harms in society. That's what regulation is primarily intended to do. And those harms are virtually across this span of life, right? There can be harms that can be occur within the banking system, all the way to harms that can control in the area of our program on pharmaceuticals or agrochemicals or industrial chemicals. So the concepts you learn in our program are applicable to any regulatory environment, although we apply them specifically to the 3 classes of chemicals, obviously. Harms can be defined as complex, multi-dimensional problems that are present in most aspects of society. They can be the consequence of a range of contributing factors, which, if well understood and analyzed, can be targeted to prevent or mitigate the harm, okay? And I'll talk to you about that in a minute. A key challenge for regulators, right, and regulatory affairs people within corporations that are applying their own, say, health and safety standards or other types of standards, both in compliance with government regulations and in compliance with their own corporate rules, all right? A key challenge for regulators is to identify factors contributing to harm and decide where best to focus prevention or mitigation, all right? So we're looking at the various causes of the harm and trying to find out which of those levers we can influence to reduce the level of harm or mitigate the level of harm being experienced. For example, if we have dangerous chemicals used in industrial processes, our primary concern is to control exposure to those chemicals beyond the use to which they were intended. All right, so that's why the regulatory system would put in various controls to control the exposure of people and the environment to that chemical. All right, so the regulation can apply to the design of the chemical itself, but it would also apply to its use. All right. Of course, all regulators are subject to resource scarcity. So when we say we're controlling harms in society, we obviously are never in a position of completely unlimited resources that we can address every single harm in society, right? So that involves a prioritization of harm reduction, all right? Yeah, and we have to prioritize because, actions in one area to address a harm create opportunity costs for another area, all right? There's only so many resources that any government has to regulate. And in even a rich country like Canada, there are strict limits on how much resources are available to address harms in society. Resource scarcity always exists. So the choice of where you put those resources is very, very important. And if you put your resources into one area, your opportunity to respond to another area is decreased. So there are opportunities and costs associated with your prioritization decisions. So therefore, the government is interested in those harms that are particularly problematic relative to average harms. I mean, jaywalking is a harm, right? But you don't find the police spending 50% of their budget trying to prevent jaywalking. All right. So, but you would find them putting substantial resources into controlling, let's say, opiates in the street, right, and these kinds of things. Okay. So, if regulatory resources in design or implementation are poorly spent, the opportunity cost might very well be very significant if another problem comes along that's far more significant. We did not anticipate it, and now we're stuck. We don't have all the resources we need to respond to the problem. All right, so regulation controlling harms, but we have to have some way to think about the causes of these harms, because those are the things the levers we're trying to pull to influence those harms. But we also have to be very concerned about what harms we choose to act on and what our rationale is for acting on them. Okay. For purposes of prioritization, heuristic categorization of harms can be useful. All right, let's look at some of these. All right. A harm is illegal, something is illegal but not harmful. It may well be a poor use of regulatory resources seen in the opportunity cost terms. And I just gave you an example of jaywalking, let's say, all right? Or the way cannabis was just prior to legalization in Canada, right? I mean, the police began to scale back a lot of enforcement in that area because relative to other harms that could be seen in the street that are applicable to criminal law, cannabis became much, much less of a concern. And then eventually the government legalized. But there are many such cases, all right? Something could be illegal and harmful. Well, if it's illegal and harmful, that might very well be a priority for action and regulatory strengthening or forceful implementation. For example, if it's illegal, there's already some law that defines it as such, right? Or there's some regulation that defines it as such. But somehow that is not mitigating the harm to an adequate extent. Governments would typically want to move quickly on prioritizing that and strengthening the regulatory environment in the area for which they originally considered there was enough harm to develop any kind of a legal infrastructure to apply to it in the first place, right? Legal but harmful, okay? The change in this would typically be the area of a new regulation or a new law, right? New law and regulation, sorry. We'll talk about the relationship between these things in the later lecture. Change might well be needed in law and regulation or the use of alternative policy instruments to bring about prevention or mitigation of that harm. So the more we go down the list, we can see that these are the ways that you can categorize harms to think about whether the government would prioritize those or not. Obviously, then there would be subcategories of criteria under those, but it gives you a broad categorization of way of thinking about harm reduction. What other factors in those categories might be applicable? Well, one that would be really applicable would be the distinction between acute and chronic harm. Okay, the potential for acute harms of a serious nature are generally ranked highly as priorities for regulation, obviously, right? Building codes, regulation on bridge construction, nuclear radiation, pharmaceuticals, things like that, where the risk of exposure is high, okay, and the risk of acute harm is high. nothing will mobilize government resources as effectively as people start dying because of a harm in society, right? That gets the media going, it gets the courts going, it gets civil liability suits going, it gets all these other political parties critiquing the government, it gets everything going, right? So governments would tend, obviously, for moral reasons, but also for political reasons, tend to target those things that are acute harms at a higher priority in any of those three categories I just gave you, all right? Chronic harms, on the other hand, can also be prioritized when there is potential for serious cumulative impacts on health, safety, and security. Pharmaceuticals is a good example of that, right? If after a period of time we're beginning to discover a lot of unforeseen negative impacts of certain pharmaceuticals or certain agrochemicals or some industrial chemicals, then and its cumulative impact is beginning to show among the population, or the die-off of fish species or bird species or insect species or whatever the case may be, the government will, that those issues may rise to the priority, to top of the priority list for the government, right? These are wide-ranging examples where this can occur, all right? But chronic harms. But as you will learn as we go through the program, governments tend to do a much better job regulating for acute harms than they do chronic harms. And that's because chronic harms, it's much more difficult to determine causality, right? And there are other reasons that we will talk about as we go through the course, all right? Now, there's another really important set of concepts. Remember the concepts. The concepts travel, right? If you take the concepts of acute as opposed to chronic harm, it can travel to any regulatory environment, right? Those three categories of harm prioritization I gave you can travel to any issue, whether it's our three classes of chemicals or any regulatory issues. That's why I want you to remember to study your course material based on making sure you understand the concepts, all right? So And another key set of concepts is the distinction between regulating based on hazards and regulating based on risks, all right? Okay, so then that's a very important distinction to be found in regulation, particularly of chemicals, right? Most developed country regulatory regimes regulate chemicals based on risk assessment rather than hazard assessment. But that's not always true. Sometimes the hazards of a chemical are so severe that the risk could never be managed appropriately, and therefore the compound can be banned on the basis of hazard alone. But most cases, the majority of cases, let's say, of chemical regulation is done based on risk assessment, okay? A hazard characteristic is that potential for a product, process, or practice to cause a harm or adverse effect in general, okay? All chemicals, right, can do have hazardous elements to them. All of them do. Even aspirin has hazardous properties to it, right? If it's abused, correct? But aspirin is still on the market. Why is that, right? Well, a risk assessment, a combination of hazardous characteristics and the likelihood that the hazard will cause real harm with its intended or possible uses or outcomes, all right? So that's the way we tend to regulate in developed countries, regulate chemicals, most chemicals. Again, it's different when we're dealing with compounds that are so hazardous that it's unlikely that any risk management regime would be able to reduce those hazards to an acceptable level, and then those compounds would be banned based on their hazardous properties, okay? A risk assessment looks at a chemical and says, yes, all chemicals have hazardous properties, but given its intended use, and we can ensure enough control over its intended use that we can still capture the benefits of that product, then we might allow it onto the market under strict regulatory control. Okay? For example, chemotherapy drugs or radioactive drugs for diagnostics and things like that, right? Extremely hazardous, right? Extremely hazardous, but we allow them on the market under very strict control regime, and that's risk assessment, okay? Most regulators would generally agree that to regulate based on hazards alone would negate two fundamental issues that regulators must concern themselves with, right? Are there benefits of a product, process, or practice despite the hazards? Okay? Can the benefits of the product, process, or practice be captured while preventing or mitigating risk of harm associated with the hazards. Okay? And that is often regulating for exposure control. Okay? So that's generally what we're talking about there. We know this compound has a lot of hazards associated with it. It also has a lot of benefits associated with it. So how do we capture those benefits while reducing the risks associated with unwanted or unplanned exposure or use? All right? Let's take an example. All right? A very simple one that I'm sure you will all understand. All pharmaceuticals have hazardous properties associated with them if they are used in ways that are contraindicated. However, pharmaceuticals also have multifaceted benefits for individuals and society. As such, to prohibit many modern pharmaceuticals because of their hazard properties would have been to deny their benefits, right? Thus, the emphasis of pharmaceutical regulation is product design to restrict unnecessary hazards and requirements to control exposure to situations not intended for the drug. All right? So that's why the regulatory regime broadly looks like that, as you will learn as we go through our course. All right? So let's look at the concept of exposure. Preventing or mitigating hazards to try to retain the benefits of a product, process, or practice requires controlling hazard exposures to people, the environment, or valued assets, right? So we want to allow the chemical on the market to capture its benefits, but are also very cognizant of its hazards. So therefore, we look for ways to control exposure in situations for which the chemical was not intended. All right, and that's what tends to be getting regulated. Okay, the characteristics of a hazard might have the potential for very serious implications, but if there is no serious prospect of exposure, the risk of capturing benefits can still be minimal. I gave you a couple examples of that, radioactive drugs and so on, right? But we also have those in industrial chemicals. Caustic chemicals that can, if you put a drop on the back of your hand, will burn right through your hand, right? Why is that on the market? Well, because it has a very specific, important economic use, but its control is extremely strict, all right, to control exposure, all right? As such, situations that expose people to hazards tend to be priorities for policy instrument intervention in the area of regulation. Okay? Regulators must understand, however, that risks associated with exposure to a hazard will vary across different groups in society and components of ecosystems. So it's not enough to say, okay, we'll control one type of exposure to one class of person. No, I mean there can be multiple kinds of exposures, with multiple different types of impacts of those exposures depending upon the subpopulation or the sub-ecosystem that's at issue. For example, the exposure of a growing 30-year-old man to certain types of chemicals, the risk of that is going to be quite a bit different than the exposure of that to, say, a 30-something-year-old pregnant woman or a child or something like that. So our regulatory regime needs to take into account a diversity of exposures to a diversity of receptors, which are the people that are exposed. Okay? Group characteristics that increase associated with exposure to a hazard, such as children, pregnant women, the elderly, the unhealthy, the poor, must be prioritized as well, right? So that's what makes regulation that much more complicated, right? We're controlling exposures. We're controlling it, though, that where there could be multiple exposures and multiple different types of receptors to that exposure. So regulation becomes that much more complex as a result of that diversity. The very fact that a risk assessment is being conducted as well implies that some risk could be deemed acceptable, or usually is deemed acceptable under certain circumstances, and that in addition to that, there will be residual risk that we did not anticipate. All right? So when we regulate for risk, we are regulating for risk, assuming that we are controlling as much of the risk as reasonable to be able to capture the benefits of that product. It might cost you $2 billion to control 80% of the risk. It might cost you $10 billion more to control the final 20%. So no regulatory infrastructure, unless something is completely banned, and even then, no regulatory infrastructure will ever be able to control all of the risk. Right? And there will always be residual, there's always accepted risk, because the product passed certain thresholds in the regulatory process, that risk is reasonable and is acceptable relative to the benefits of the product. But then there can be residual risk on top of that, which also implies that not every regulatory system is going to be perfect in anticipating all forms of risk. Okay? So all risk assessment processes must adopt a judgment about what threshold of risk is acceptable and what is not, and under what circumstances. Okay? So this also makes the regulatory process a lot more complex than it seems, right? Oh, we can just control this or control that. Well, you know what? Look at all we built a matrix around all of the things I just told you, the forms of exposure, the receptors of exposure, the type of risk, residual risk, all of those things, you can see that this becomes a very, very multivariate matrix, okay? So, and when we establish thresholds in risk assessment, we also constrain ourselves, okay? Because what is acceptable exposure risk will constrain activities of the regulator, okay? Limiting the flexibility of the regulator to provide protections from harm beyond what accepted thresholds would allow. Remember what I told you last week. All regulation is fundamentally political. Science can tell us what the risk is, but it cannot tell us what is an acceptable threshold of risk for us as Canadians, or for Indians as Indians, or for the Chinese people as Chinese, or for the Brazilian people as Brazilians, right? We have different tolerances in the political system. We have different value judgments about what is acceptable risk. Okay, and that's why when I say something like regulation is always fundamentally political, this is what I'm talking about. All right, in addition to the way the regulatory process is set up, way regulations are developed, and the way regulations are implemented and enforced. Okay, does that mean it's biased and it means nothing? No, absolutely does not mean that. It means that no regulatory process is ever going to be perfect on these matters, right? There's always an opportunity for continuous improvement in regulation. Tending the regulatory process also towards factual evidence rather than the precautionary principle is what comes with risk assessment, because risk assessment is a science-intensive exercise, right? And explaining that to the people and allowing representation for the regulatory process from non-experts and so on is made more difficult from this, okay? And that also contributes to perceptions of political distance and contributes to concerns about the fairness or the objectivity of the regulatory process, right? And citizens get concerned about that, right? As we've seen in recent controversies around glyphosate and Roundup and the econics and the killing off of bees and so on and so on. People begin to say, well, yeah, okay, but wait a second now. I mean, who's influencing this process? And that's why it's very, very important that the regulatory process have very, very clear rules and very, very high levels of transparency and very, very high levels of public legitimacy with respect to the expertise of the process. And we learned about that a little bit last week, okay? Plus risk assessment relies a lot on quantitative analysis, which tends to undervalue knowledge that is not expressed quantitatively. For example, I mean, when you're looking at the impact of chemicals on the natural ecosystem, a lot of things in the ecosystem and the environment, broader environment, are not expressed quantitatively, let alone monetized, right? Birds don't fly by with price stickers on them. Rivers don't flow by with price stickers on them. Look, these are the types of things that can be undervalued in a quantitatively intensive process like regulation, okay? So that's also a limitation of risk assessment, all right? But nevertheless, right, we do it. Why? Because we're trying to capture the benefits of chemicals in a modern society. Relying on complex methodology is another characteristic, and you're going to learn about all these things as we go through the program. But I want you to separate yourself from being purely a technicist about it, but also to view these technical requirements, these science requirements, these thresholds, these tests we do for chemicals before we allow them on the market. I want you to view them with a detached perspective, that nothing is ever 100% objective, right? Science can tell us where we are on something, but it cannot give us the value judgments of whether we should be there or not. All right? So these are all important considerations for you to understand what we regulate. And again, we're still at the very high level right now because I'm laying down some very fundamental sort of overarching concepts for regulation. And as we get further on in the course, you'll see how these concepts will filter down into the specifics of the material that you learn. Okay? On that note, I'm going to close off and I'll see you next week for lesson 3. All right? Have a good week. And if I'm talking to you this week on Zoom call, which I believe I am, then I'll be talking to you then. All right? Take care for now. Bye-bye.